Simon and Jacob, you had two questions along the lines of comparisons of George Bush to both Presidents Kennedy and Johnson, with, I think, the implication that the president's Iraq was their Vietnam. Can you take on that question?
I mean, I was a very young journalist, was in Vietnam at the very end of that war, and attended the relevant briefings. And this is not a very well-informed comment, but my view was that the Vietnam War and occupation of South Vietnam was far more competently executed than the occupation of Iraq. The occupation of Iraq was, and I've followed American and British occupation troops around the world for most of my career, the occupation of Iraq was simply the most incompetent thing I've ever seen. It was stupefyingly incompetent. And I've no doubt at all that many people, possibly on the platform, wouldn't disagree with that, because it was conducted by a very small group of people against the advice of a much larger group of people within the administration. It simply has been a catastrophe. Afghanistan is much better conducted, although I think it's a much more difficult war to fight. And that's why I think it's going to end in greater tears than Iraq will end. Iraq is fairly simple to end. You just leave. It'll be very, very difficult to leave Afghanistan. But certainly in Vietnam, I think you had, on the whole, relatively competent military people there. They had experience of career, many of them. They lost, but they only just lost. I do think that America could have stabilized South Vietnam had it stayed longer. It was not the right place to be and the right thing to do, but it was not a hopeless case. I think when you go into a country without a good reason, or with the purpose of simply punishing the country, as was the case in both Iraq and Afghanistan, you're not likely to do well because you haven't really plotted what the purpose of this exercise is. It was simply to punish. And I think it's that punitive element that's been the problem, certainly in Iraq. And I'm sorry, I've been there only twice, but I cannot accept that it is in any sense of the word a success.
Jacob?
Just on sorry to step on your well-deserved applause, Simon. Just on LBJ, the questioner asked what courageous thing did he ever do. Just for starters, how about saying goodbye to the South, to the Democratic Party for generations, when he signed the Civil Rights Act in '64 and the Voting Rights Act in 1965. Johnson knew that would be the political consequence of that decision, and he did it anyway. To me, that's almost a definition of political courage. On judgment, however, I don't think Johnson does so well in Vietnam, and I think it's quite comparable to Bush. I think both of them were very poor. I think both of them were essentially unable to admit error, to recognize error, and to reverse error. And whereas Johnson, it was a slightly different story, and you get into sort of psychological territory here, but Johnson clearly didn't trust Kennedy's advisors. He had this long-standing issue with the Kennedy brothers, and I think he was getting some good advice from some of the Kennedy people, but I think he couldn't hear it because who was giving it. And likewise with Bush on Iraq, certainly the advice he got from Colin Powell at the very beginning, not to invade Iraq, was very good advice, but I think Bush was so blinded by his own motives, whatever you think they were, that I think he effectively couldn't hear that. And then he couldn't hear the very good advice that I said came from Bill Kristol, among other people, that the strategy was failing. And it finally took just a series. I mean, it got to the point, really, where there was a total consensus that the strategy was failed and that Rumsfeld was failing. And I think Bush postponed change until there was absolutely no choice. Okay,
we're coming down to our last few minutes of questions, and I would like to make it a little bit forward-looking, and I just want to see if any of the hands up here have questions related to what President-elect Obama inherits from President Bush. Is anybody thinking along those lines quite clearly? And don't snooker me, because I'll squash your question if it's... Gentleman with the stubble. That's what it is.
I think we all know that this motion won't really be decided here tonight, but it very well may be in 12 years, in 16 years, in 20 years. For those against the motion, can you paint us a picture of the world that would make your case?
Yeah. Iraq as a functioning semi-democracy in the heart of the Middle East, as an example that would be a powerful antidote to the terrorist image of what the future ought to be like. Afghanistan stabilized a continued decline in the ability of terrorist elements like al-Qaeda to threaten the West, a continued diminution in their ability to recruit, which incidentally I think you may have seen or heard about the new report out, which shows a dramatic decline in their operational capability and in their recruitment ability, and a world where the institutions that the President is seeking to leave in place, like PEPFAR and the Millennium Challenge, have revolutionized and changed America's pattern of foreign assistance to focus on results and transparency and accountability. And new institutions, whether it is the replacement for Kyoto with the G8 agreement this year to pursue a new international regime in which all the major emitters are at the table and all the major emitters are focused on energy efficiency and technological advances that allow them to clean the air and reduce greenhouse gases like we have done. We're the only economy. The last year for which numbers are available were 2006. There's only one industrialized economy in the world that grows that year and reduces the absolute level of greenhouse gases. It's the United States of America because of the approach we're pursuing.
Okay.
That's how it would look abroad.
Let me just add, just very briefly, and make it a little sharper perhaps. Look, from 1979 on, the Iranian Revolution and the disastrous Saudi Wahhabi decision to compete with the Iranian Revolution by exporting Wahhabi Islam much more aggressively abroad, enabled to do that by the, obviously, oil revenues from the 70s, once they were able to jack up oil prices in the 70s. Jihadism, Islamic extremism, terrorism has been unfortunately on the rise, doing some damage to us and huge damage, obviously, within the Islamic world and in the Middle East and in the greater Middle East and in South Asia. A successful Bush foreign policy, a successful U.S. foreign policy, which would have been begun by President Bush 10 or 20 years from now, would have reversed that. And I think we are on the cusp of reversing that. I think that is why the intervention in Iraq, the stabilizing of Iraq as a non-extremist, non-terror-friendly regime in the center of the Middle East, the crushing of al-Qaeda, and there's some very difficult things still to be done with Pakistan, but at least so far maintaining a decent civilian government in Pakistan while moving aggressively against the terror, the parts of Pakistan that have become terror, have been for quite a long time, terror-friendly. Reversing that would be incredibly important. That is really crucial to having a decent 21st century. And I think Bush has begun to reverse it. There's much more that has to be done. I trust that President Obama will do it. And secondly, nuclear weapons. It's amazing that we have had as little proliferation of nuclear weapons as we've had, many experts think, over the last 50 years. In retrospect, the Pakistani explosion of nuclear weapons in '98, and I was no more prescient about this than anyone else, was a huge moment, a very dangerous moment. And what IQ2 was doing, unbeknownst to us and to others, was unbelievably dangerous. It made possible the North Korea program. It's made possible the Iranian program. It accelerated the Iranian program. If we can prevent the spread of nuclear weapons, and that means preventing Iran from going nuclear, because if Iran goes nuclear, other nations in the Middle East go nuclear, and we're off to the races, then with a combination of nuclear weapons and possible terrorism and jihadist connections, that's unbelievably dangerous. So I would say Bush, I think, has done a pretty good job of beginning with that. I might have done a few things more hawkish than Bush, actually, in terms of confronting Iran. But, he's got the Europeans together for the first time with serious sanctions through the UN Security Council, the United Front. He's handing Obama to put as much pressure as possible on Iran. If he can turn around the negative momentum on nuclear proliferation and on Islamic jihadism, we will have a much safer world if we can turn it around over the next 20 years, if all of us can turn it around the world. If not, we're in a lot of trouble.